So I'll take it to the SEC where they have a situation where everyone plays within the division, of course, and then they play two non-division opponents, and one of those is set, just like the ACC does the same thing. One of those is a set rival, and in some cases, that rival is legit. Alabama, Tennessee have been playing forever. It's a big deal, so forth and so on. Auburn, Georgia, the South's oldest rivalry, etc. But then they fill in the blank on other rivalries just to have a designated team. And I don't know why they do that or why that's necessary. Ole Miss and Vandy, Kentucky, Mississippi State. There's no connection between these. Texas A&M and South Carolina. You can't pick two schools that have less to do with one another than those two. Why do they have to play every year? I would hope that the Big Ten would assess each team and say, okay, who are natural rivals to that school? And how can we make this as uniform as possible? But if we don't make it uniform, is that if Ohio State has three and Purdue has three and a number of teams have three, but some only have two and some only have one, is that okay? And can we work through some schedule models to see if that works? Why force there to be set opponents to some schools that aren't validated by any kind of connection or rivalry?
Yeah, and the forcing of the rivalry has, I don't know, has it worked with Penn State and Michigan State with the land grant trophy? Penn State comes in and it's like, okay, you and Michigan State, you guys will play the last week every year, whatever. And that's been what, 30 years now almost. And it's kind of something, but it's still manufactured. It's been manufactured. And so, yeah, it almost feels it's certainly not organic. And the thing about college football rivalries is the great ones are organic. And so, yeah, maybe you don't shoehorn stuff in. And I think why would some programs be against that? Like, oh no, we want our three team. We want to know who they are every 2 years or whatever. And it's like, well, you will know in advance. You know in plenty of time who the teams are, but I don't know why they would get upset about, well, Ohio State has three rivals and we only have one. And it's like, well, that's because you're Indiana. You have one rival. Like, do you want more? I don't think you do. I think you want to just go ahead and, do you want to have a rivalry with Ohio State? Because we can make one if you want one. We can give you, the I-71 trophy or whatever, the I-70 trophy. And now you get to play Ohio State every year. Here you go. Be careful what you ask for.
As soon as you brought that up about Michigan State, Penn State, of course, they do play at the conclusion of each season. And then once Maryland and Rutgers joined, they attached them. And that seemed to make, there's a regional proximity, of course, with the two teams. And then it was as though the Big Ten second guessed itself. So at the same time that they added Penn State, Michigan State as a rivalry the last weekend of the season, and then a couple decades later, Nebraska, Iowa, and then a few years later, this Maryland Rutgers, they kind of second guessed themselves for a few years because I knew they took a break from that for a few years. So in 2016, they broke from Michigan State, Penn State, and actually 2017 for 3 years, they broke it up. And they went with Michigan State taking on Maryland. They took on Rutgers, and they had Rutgers. Maybe they felt as though we're kind of sanctioning off Maryland and Rutgers, and they just feel like they're kind of a addendum to the league or something, and they don't really count. So we want to integrate them into this. So, but then now they've reverted back to Michigan State and Penn State. So it's kind of odd there. But I like that they went unconventional when they reorganized the divisions and they said, our only cross-division rivalry is Purdue and Indiana. So we're going to play that. And we're not going to make things up.
Yeah, I mean, and Ohio State and Illinois used to be tied together. They've got a rivalry. That's the only trophy Ohio State plays for in Big Ten is the Illa Buck. And it's like, well, that's no longer, don't worry about it. They'll play again eventually. And it's not something that has to happen. But yeah, I think it's okay to, as we're going through all of these changes, you don't have to make everybody uniform. You can, by when you make everything uniform, that can almost eliminate some of the fairness you're trying to create when you're just putting people together. Well, we've these three natural people, these natural rivalries exist. Now we have to create unnatural rivalries, and or you can just alternate who they play, every year, and then you can eventually, maybe by doing that, something happens that a rivalry is created.
Have you figured out the way you would do it? And if you want to save that for an article, you can just give us a quick hint and tease, and then you can point us in that direction.
No, because the thing is, I will eventually try to figure out how I would do it, because you immediately think, I like the idea of you have three teams you play every year, but for Ohio State, that's automatically Penn State, Michigan, and Michigan State. And now you have to think about, but what if it's not? And so, which one of those teams do you give up, and who do you change it for? Because you know, I I don't know that Ohio State needs to play Michigan State every year. You know, I wouldn't mind seeing them play Nebraska, frankly, or Wisconsin every year, or something like that. And I don't know that it needs to be three teams, but the math works out well with you play three teams every year, and then the other five teams in an 8-game schedule. Every If a player stays for 4 years, he will play at every venue in the Big Ten, and he will play every team twice. Whereas in the SEC right now, with the way they do some things, you'll have entire a decade without going to a place. So I like the idea of playing at every place within a 4-year span, especially somebody who travels to these games and you get to see different places and experience them. So I think that would probably be where I start, but I don't think it's a simple process to just figure out, okay, who plays who and who plays every year. And that's what the computer programs are for. But even determining who are your three opponents every year, like if that's who they're gonna do it, like that gets tricky as well, and you're gonna have to make sacrifices, I think.
And I think it depends on the age of the person that's looking this over, because for if you're 20 years old, Ohio State, Michigan State seems like, well, they have to play. It's only been since 2013 that they last did not play a regular season game against each other, because they were in opposite divisions. And before 2010, there were no divisions. And there were certain teams, and Tony, you probably remember the schedule format prior to divisions better than I do, because I don't know that I ever knew how they figured out who was playing who, besides, of course, Ohio State and Michigan are playing. And Ohio State and Penn State, they always play those two. And I always thought that was unfair to those two schools to have to play each other, even though it was a game everyone wanted to see. But Michigan State seemed to be one of those teams that Ohio State saw as infrequently as just about anybody in the conference. There seemed to be, 2-year stretches they didn't see Michigan State, then they'd play them a few years, and then they wouldn't see them for 2 years. And there were certain teams like that. Purdue, there were gaps in there, but it didn't seem to be equitable.
Yeah, and I'm just trying to think back to the teams that I saw when I was in school there, and teams that I didn't get to see. And yeah, it didn't seem like there's a rhyme or reason, other than you played most of them, because there were only 10, 11 teams at the time. And so it wouldn't be too hard to catch up on the three that you didn't see, or however many. But I think having a uniform system in terms of how often, and knowing that you will play every team in a 4-year span, I think that's a good way to go. And just, it allows everybody to benefit from being in that conference. It allows Minnesota to get a home game with Ohio State every 4 years, to get a home game with Michigan every 4 years. Although, there's another thing: Michigan and Minnesota have a rivalry. Are they tied together? Like, do you take that rivalry away? And so there's a lot in there where you have to try to keep all of that going, and it's probably more difficult with a smaller pod than it is with a larger pod.